projections for 2024, 2025 fuel prices in the extreme winter pricing model, while the baseline projection for 2024 and 2025 is already based on historical data from 2003 to 2018, which includes the extreme winter price year of 2013 to 2014. So in other words, I believe that the impact of the extreme winter prices that were experienced in 2013 and 2014 were already baked into the baseline projection for 2024-2025 prices, and then TCR applied an additional markup to that price. The testimony offered in response to questions about their methodology was not clear, but I do think it's reasonable for the Commission to still have some questions about whether the estimate of the benefits of the increase in the PPA market value during a period of extreme winter fuel prices might be overstated. And then finally, is the risk that the economic benefits to Rhode Island may not be fully realized. The economic benefit to Rhode Island from this PPA is estimated to be $405 million. The total economic benefit is described as direct, indirect, and induced impacts on employment, earnings, output, and the value added during the construction and operations phase of the project. But neither of the models of the economic impacts to Rhode Island considered the potential impact of any increases or decreases in electric bills or the cost of electric power that might result from this PPA. So the Commission must consider the risk of unknown economic impacts of changes in electric rates, bills, and energy costs on Rhode Island's economy. The PPA is projected to have direct net costs of $123 million during the first 4 years of operation. Based on an annual unitized amount per kilowatt hour, the average residential ratepayer, which is the 500 kilowatt hours a month or 6,000 kilowatt hours per year, will pay approximately $164 for this PPA over the first 4 years. That rate impact scales linearly with consumption up to a 19.7 million kilowatt hour per year customer who will pay a little over $540,000 for this PPA over the first 4 years. Based on the projections in PUC 5-1, ratepayers will recoup their costs over the following 11 years. So despite expert testimony that it's important to understand the impacts of the net direct costs on employment and other economic indicators in the early years of this PPA, that analysis was not conducted. Also unexplored by the analysis is the timing of the economic impacts. So the net direct cost of this PPA will be charged to ratepayers at the beginning of the operations phase when construction-related employment and earnings benefits end. And so the Commission, I believe, should be concerned or be aware that the economic impacts to Rhode Island of changes to energy bills and rates from the direct cost of the PPA have not been analyzed and the impact is unknown.
So thank you. And I guess I'll go back to my some thoughts I had as I was thinking about this, and I think that it's certainly the case, and it came out in testimony, that there are many uncertainties involved. And I think, Alan, you put it very nicely. You said, you made the point that the analysis was based on forecasts, and the forecasts involve a lot of variables, and there's a lot of uncertainty with all the variables. And that brings me back to the famous adage, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So I think we saw this. I think I think that there are going to be a lot of risks. You've done a great job laying out for the record that we do have risk all over the place. Ratepayers are going to bear the risk of the uncertainty. On the other hand, there may be more benefits than anticipated, so it could cut both ways. Putting aside the risk that the benefit calculations or the cost calculations are incorrect, the argument was made by the consultant for Deepwater Wind or Revolution Wind that even if we don't get as many benefits as predicted, we will still get reliable, clean energy, a large amount of it for a commercially reasonable price as compared to other similar projects on the market. I found that argument compelling, and especially compelling when you look at how long it takes to do anything. It's taken us a long time to reduce our energy through our award-winning, best in the country energy efficiency program. That's great, but that's not going to get us where we want to go. We have constraints on the gas pipeline side. We have a lot of problems citing smaller scale renewable energy. So I don't disagree with your comments, but I do feel that this contract to procure 400 megawatts of offshore wind is consistent with state policy, which has been codified in legislation, long-term contracting law, the Renewable Energy Growth Program, the ACES law, and the Resilient Rhode Island Act. And in that, Rhode Island has codified strong support for clean energy, support for carbon emission reduction, and I think this project, getting away from the risks, goes a long way to supporting those goals.
And I agree with that. And again, the purpose of my comments,
I understand.
the testimony is, we don't have any testimony to the contrary that the benefits exceed the cost. That's the record. The purpose of my comments is to be clear-eyed and transparent that, like I said, it's not a sure bet. There is risk. As the ones approving, as the ones whose names will ultimately be on that, I want to be transparent about those risks up front, so nobody is surprised if it's ultimately a net cost. But you're right, it could be a bigger benefit than anticipated as well.
And I would just like to say, I want to thank you for bringing those all to everyone's attention, because I do think that it's important that in any analysis that we do, but particularly in something relatively new like this, that it's important to be honest and transparent, and it's important that anyone who's interested in knowing the kinds of details that we know, simply because we read through all of this stuff and have extended hearings and have the opportunity to really delve into very detailed questions about the things that are contained in the testimony that's presented to us in the hearings. Nevertheless, the fact that there are great possibilities of risk affecting both costs and benefits, I don't think and I don't think that you suggested that means we shouldn't go forward with this, that our ruling on the evidence can still be made positively while acknowledging all of these other things, just so that it's clear to anyone who wants to know what's involved in terms of the risk and the benefits.
That's fair enough. I mean, I think if you look back at many big environmental leaps that we've taken in the past, if you did an exhaustive cost-benefit analysis in the beginning and the end, it's unclear how it would move forward. So I'd second your
Paralysis.
Exactly. That's a big danger.
Is there anything further? All in favor?
Aye.
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 All right. That brings us to greenhouse gas reduction targets. I move that we find that the PPA is consistent with the region's greenhouse gas reduction targets.
Second?
Discussion? I think we have substantial evidence in the record and nothing contravening that evidence. All in favor?
Aye.
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 That brings us to purposes of ACES. I move that we find that the PPA is consistent with the purposes of the Affordable Clean Energy Security Act.
Second?
Discussion? Again, I believe we have substantial testimony and none of it in opposition to that holding. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I move that we approve the PPA based on the fact that we found that all the requirements of ACES have been met.
Second?
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
That brings us to remuneration. I move that the company is not entitled to the remuneration requested.
Second?
Discussion?
Sure, I have. I can tell you what I've been thinking about with respect to remuneration. And again, I broke it into a number of arguments. The first is that National Grid has not proposed remuneration in the form of incentives. National Grid is entitled to remuneration under certain statutory conditions, particularly when the company is obligated to procure. But here, clearly, National Grid is voluntarily procuring the proposed PPA. The ACES statute does not require the company to procure any resources, and the company is not entering into the PPA in order to meet a mandatory policy. In docket 4822, National Grid explains explains in quotes the Commission's discretion to approve remuneration in the form of incentives for voluntary procurements. That was in the context of explaining that under the long-term contracting standard, National Grid is obligated to procure 90 megawatts and is entitled to remuneration equal to 2.75% of the contract value for those 90 megawatts. For any additional capacity above that obligation, voluntarily procured by the company, as the company stated, the Commission has discretion to approve remuneration in the form of incentives. And in that docket, National Grid provided examples of discretionary incentives approved by the Commission in other dockets. The two examples that they provided were the Gas Procurement Incentive Plan, or the GPIP, and the Natural Gas Portfolio Management Plan incentive. The GPIP incentive encourages the company to look for opportunities to lock in a fixed price on discretionary gas purchases, so that the average hedge costs are lower with the discretionary purchases than without. The company's incentive varies depending on the unit cost savings of the discretionary purchases and the timing. The NGPMP is an incentive to encourage the company to maximize savings to customers through optimization of the company's pipeline, transportation, storage, and supply assets. The company looks for opportunities to release capacity and make bundled sales using the portfolio of gas supply assets, when the gas supply assets are not needed to meet firm sales customer requirements. And they receive a percentage of the savings when the total annual savings exceed $2 million. My point here is that Mr. Hebert cites the long-term contracting standard as justification for giving National Grid remuneration equal to 2.75% of the Revolution Wind PPA value. But National Grid's own explanation of the Commission's discretion to approve remuneration in the form of incentives does not support Mr. Hebert's remuneration proposal. The GPIP and the NGPMP encourage the company to be strategic and optimize forward-going performance for the benefit of ratepayers and allow the company to retain a share of those benefits. In the Revolution Wind 1 PPA case, Mr. Hebert testifies that the company cannot manage or maximize the forward-going economic or environmental benefits created by this project over its 20-year life, and argues that the division has no basis in Rhode Island law for correlating remuneration with benefits in the context of procuring long-term renewable contracts. Furthermore, if the company reviews the Revolution Wind 1 PPA as a hedge, and therefore somewhat analogous to the GPIP, then the remuneration should be similarly structured as a shared savings incentive based on the actual savings realized by ratepayers at the end of the contract term. More generally, the application of the least cost procurement and system reliability procurement guidance on performance incentive mechanisms is misplaced when applied to the instant remuneration proposal. First, as Mr. Weiss testified, this is not a least cost procurement filing. If the company does not have the obligation to demonstrate that this is a least cost procurement, it should not be rewarded under the least cost procurement statute. And as I already said, Mr. Hebert testified that the company cannot manage or maximize the forward-going economic or environmental benefits created by this project. Under the remuneration proposal, the company is not accountable to the realization of the direct or indirect benefits of the PPA. As Ms. Domenico testified, if no net benefits are realized, the company will still recover the cost of deliveries, and that to earn the proposed remuneration, all the company has to do is take delivery and pay the bill. Furthermore, Mr. Brennan explains that there is nothing ratepayers can do to achieve the benefits of this contract, and he explained that the benefits of this project are dependent on wholesale market prices, and ratepayers will pay regardless of above or below market cost of the project. In the absence of a performance-based incentive, and to justify offering action-based remuneration for an action that has already been executed, Mr. Schrag proposed remuneration as a gratuity to promote ongoing collaboration. But the record offers no economic justification for why receiving $1 million for entering the Revolution Wind PPA is the marginal value that will motivate the company to collaborate in the future. While there may be policy or political reasons for providing a gratuity to the company, the Commission is an economic regulator, and we haven't received legislative or guidance from the legislature on policy reasons for remuneration under ACES. Paying for energy and RECs paying above market prices for energy and RECs can be viewed as the internalization of the non-embedded cost of greenhouse gas pollution from power generation. And this is a valid ratepayer cost. Electricity cost consumers are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions and should pay the cost associated with reducing those emissions. But paying gratuities to the utility to encourage future cooperation on achieving state policy goals is not the internalization of an externality. So if the purpose of the gratuity is to ensure that the utility continues to assist the administration in achieving its goals, then that case should be made to the legislature. And the legislature's existing guidance on providing remuneration tracks as follows. In 2009, under long-term contracting for renewable energy, the legislature allowed 2.75%. In 2011, for distributed generation contracts, it allowed 2.75%. In 2014, for renewable energy growth program, it was 1.75%. And then in 2014, for ACES, there's no remuneration. So I'll stop there before I get into the arguments that were made in more directly in the testimony.
You can do, because I just have general points.
I also didn't think that National Grid, my second reason is National Grid did not provide convincing evidence of harm. Mr. Hebert argued that remuneration is necessary to avoid an adverse effect on the company's credit quality, which would increase the cost of utility operations for customers. Mr. Hebert implied that remuneration is an explicit recognition of that outcome and a clear step to avoid it. But Mr. Hebert could not provide specific evidence of any utility whose credit rating has been downgraded due to a power purchase agreement. Furthermore, Mr. Hebert did not provide evidence that the proposed remuneration of $88 million will prevent a downgrade, and he did not quantify the risk and the cost of a downgrade to ratepayers. Mr. Hebert cited Moody's August 2016 downgrade of the Hawaiian Electric Company as an example, but in that credit opinion, it didn't cite a power purchase agreement as the rationale for HECO's downgrade. The rationale for the downgrade included underfunded pension obligations and the criticism from the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission regarding HECO's lack of progress toward achieving the state's RPS of 100% by 2045. That criticism included disappointment expressed by the chairman of the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission regarding the slow pace of HECO's acquisition and integration of renewable resources. But in our decision here, we're not expressing disappointment with National Grid's performance, quite the opposite. We're authorizing the company to enter into a significant PPA. I also thought that Mr. Hebert's arguments are inconsistent with National Grid's experience procuring standard offer service. The financial obligations under this PPA are smaller and likely to be less volatile than the company's obligations under its standard offer service procurements. Total standard offer service expense ranged from over $300 million to over $700 million annually during the period from 2001 to 2009, and has been recovered without remuneration from only standard offer service customers. Mr. Heber testified that the financial commitment associated with Revolution 1 PPA is about $160 million in nominal dollars annually for 20 years with a biennial delivery requirement, a fixed price per kilowatt hour, and cost recovery spread over all distribution customers, providing a relatively high degree of predictability. And finally, National Grid does not convincingly demonstrate that the company is accepting a risk or investing capital. Mr. Cahill testified that credit rating agencies will evaluate the company's financial exposure in terms of the cost recovery mechanism for the PPA. Mr. Cahill explained that an explicit full cost recovery mechanism that provides for an annual reconciliation to ensure that the company obtained dollar for dollar recovery of all PPA payments fully protects the company's earnings and cash flow over time. Mr. Cahill convincingly argued that given such a cost recovery mechanism, utility customers will bear 100% of the market pricing risk for this PPA, or Orsted will bear all the project development and operational risks, and National Grid bears none of the market price risk. If the company's credit rating is downgraded due to the PPA, Mr. Cahill testified that the company will be fully compensated through their rate-making process. Ratepayers currently pay for the company's balance sheet, providing remuneration to avoid a credit rating downgrade risk that ratepayers will overpay or double pay for the company's balance sheet. And so I agree with Mr. Cahill's conclusion that Mr. Hebert's assertion that the provision of a utility profit component for a PPA is unconvincing. Mr. Cahill summarized that the PPA requires no new capital investment by the company or its shareholders, and that the company is already being fully compensated for its balance sheet capital through the commission authorized return on equity.
Ratepayers, but as Commissioner Anthony pointed out, then the division provided some arguments for that, which were in contrast to the company's own testimony that they were not looking for a performance incentive per se. And moreover, the division did not provide specific recommendations, but rather very broad guardrails with an high end and low end. That did not provide the evidence that we would need to support a level of remuneration different than what the company proposed. And I also point to some of the discussion that we had earlier about the uncertainty of the costs and benefits of the project, and adding remuneration, which is very significant on top of that, would put further risk on ratepayers, which I thought at this point was not warranted. And then finally, no evidence was presented on the record with regards to remuneration from a recent project in Connecticut. That leads one to assume that if remuneration had been provided, documentation of such would have been put onto the record. So that's just a very recent transaction.
And I agree with both of my co-commissioners and everything that they have said. There's no question that there's no legal requirement for remuneration here. There has not been sufficient proof to show that any policy considerations should require remuneration. contrary, I think that Mr. Schubert's testimony overall on the topic of remuneration was not credible. The Hawaii situation upon which he sought to rely, I believe, is totally distinguishable from the situation before us. And I think that there's just simply insufficient evidence was produced for us to allow remuneration. Is there any further discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
That brings us to cost recovery. I move that we should order that National Grid is entitled to cost recovery through a mechanism that projects costs on at least an annual basis and allows for reconciliation of those costs on at least an annual basis.
Second?
Discussion. We've already found that the PPA is beneficial to Rhode Island and to Rhode Island ratepayers. It's uncontroverted that National Grid is entitled to cost recovery of the costs incurred that are found beneficial to ratepayers. National Grid is typically allowed to project the costs of a PPA on at least an annual basis and reconcile those costs on at least an annual basis. So I think it's clear that it's appropriate. Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Next, we just need to address the mechanism. I move that we, at this point, decline to approve a specific cost recovery factor and direct that National Grid approximately 1 year prior to its reasonable expectation that the project will achieve commercial operation, file a proposed mechanism to recover the cost of the energy and RECs produced by the project.
Second?
Discussion.
Mr. Brennan testified that the requirements of the PPA are contingent on the Commission's approval of a full cost recovery with timely true-ups, but that the exact mechanism of the cost recovery is not as important right now. And that the Commission could approve the PPA in order the company to propose a specific cost recovery mechanism 1 year prior to commercial operation. I also just generally don't think that the impact and the nature of the cost recovery mechanism has, that we have enough of a developed record on it right now. The impacts of a per kilowatt hour charge or credit versus a fixed charge or credit are really different across all the different allocators, customer class allocators. I think that would benefit from a more robust discussion when we get closer to the commercial operation date.
I agree. Further discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Further comment? Observation? Anything? Is there a motion to adjourn? Hearing no opposition, we adjourn by acclamation.